We're here with Mickey Osterreicher, the General Counsel for the National Press Photographers Association, to talk about drone rules and regulations. So Mickey, can you summarize the state of drone rules as they pertain to pro photographers?
It's in flux. How's that? Literally, it's almost like watching a stock ticker. It changes every day, almost. Kind of just to start, the FAA is the authority that basically controls the national airspace. And that's from the ground up as high as you can go. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, they were tasked with having a final rule regarding small UAS, that's any drone that's under 55 pounds, in September of 2015. They didn't have the final rule until August of 2016. In the interim, a number of states decided to weigh in, not only states, but municipalities in terms of coming in with rules prohibiting the use of drones. Since then, we've seen a hodgepodge of rules across the country, so much so that some states, including Michigan and Florida, have now said, no, we're going to exercise a state rule and not have little local rules, but one state rule. Really, the FAA operates as a number of other federal organizations in that they have federal preemption over these rules. There have been challenges to some of the rules. In Singer v. Newton, which is a case up in Massachusetts, Dr. Singer brought an action against the town of Newton for enacting these restrictions. And the federal court found that he was correct, that there was federal preemption, that the city did not have the ability to do that. That's what we thought the rule was going to be. On October 20th, the last day they filed the appeal, the city of Newton just appealed that decision. So now we're going to see what's going to happen.
So if you're a photographer, you should basically work your way from the FAA down.
What you need to do if you're a photographer, first of all, you need to be Part 107 certified. You can't just fly. It's the same thing as having a license and registration. It's one of the reasons that we've done the drone journalism workshops, is to help train people prepare for the Part 107 exam.
And can you explain just briefly what that 107 exam is?
Yeah, it's a 2-hour multiple choice exam. You only need a 70% rate to pass. You take it, you go to a site where they do these testing. You can set it up ahead of time. It's $150 to take the test. If you don't pass, you can take it 14 days later. But really, if you prepare and study, there's no reason why you can't pass. And then get your license. And if you want to see what one looks like, I can show you. That's what one looks like. And you have to have a license and registration and be able to provide it to law enforcement if you're flying a drone. So it's just the same way as you're driving a car.
Right.
You need to have your documents with you.
But unlike a car, you don't have to take a flying test. You're taking a knowledge test.
You don't have to take a road test. Yes, right. It's a knowledge test, which is exactly the point. It's one thing to pass a knowledge test. It's another thing to be able to fly one safely and properly and ethically. And there are all those questions involved. But in terms of the state of regulation, just to make it even more current, on October 11th, AUVSI, which is the world's largest organization of unmanned vehicles, both in the air, on the ground, and underwater, wrote a letter to President Trump, which NPPA, along with a number of other organizations, signed on to, like DJI and so on. We were the only news organization that signed on to it. One of the things that we're seeing is, even though there's federal preemption, there's so many local regulations. We're trying to figure out a way how to work together. And so that letter was written on October 11th. Just the other day, President Trump issued a presidential memorandum setting up a pilot program to figure out how we're going to do it. And they're talking about maybe states and local controlling airspace from 0 to 200, the FAA 200 to 400, kind of a sliding scale. But as I said, we all think we're very sophisticated. We have iPhones, we have all the information, but we're not really any further along than when the Wright brothers started flying. I mean, that's really where we're at. In terms of regulations, there were none back then. We're seeing some now. Problem is technology just goes at this exponential rate, and the law and regulations and bureaucracy, kind of move at this glacial speed, and we kind of have to try and keep up as best we can. But we're seeing really some major changes. I just had NPPA held a drone journalism leadership summit. It was kind of the culmination of the workshops, and we had pretty much the newsroom leaders from every news organization, AP and Hearst and Gannett and the New York Times and the Washington Post and the networks. And we were talking about, what's next. We had the head of the small UAS a unit from the FAA. It was an off-the-record conversation, so everybody could talk frankly. But one of the things besides Part 107 is getting waivers. Getting waivers, to be in certain areas that you might not be normally allowed in. To get a waiver in the past, you had to submit it about 90 days in advance and keep your fingers crossed. Between Harvey and Irma, we literally were getting, there was a guy from USA Today who was on the phone with the FAA getting waivers within 20 minutes while they were trying to cover Irma. So things have, we all sat there with our mouths open.
Well,
the FAA is certainly willing to work on things. There's a new program that was they were talking about. It's going to be at certain airports. It's called Lance. It's basically an automated system. Kind of get into the system, ask for the waiver, and it can get approved almost instantly.
Yeah, no, this is an important point, I think, because I don't know if many photographers, photojournalists, maybe not in a news organization, know that you can't treat the drone camera like you would a handheld camera, that there are instances where even for news gathering, you're not allowed to fly a drone. So how are there basic principles that govern whether
Absolutely.
You should shoot?
Yeah, the First Amendment. And the First Amendment basically says that Congress shall not abridge certain things: speech, the press, religion. So we're talking about speech because photography has been deemed to be a form of expression, which is a form of speech, which is why it's protected under the First Amendment. But it's not absolute. It's subject to what's known as reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. And those restrictions have to meet other requirements, one of which is they have to be narrowly tailored to meet a state interest. Here the state interest is air safety. Mm-hmm. Okay, where normally when you're on the ground, if you're in a traditional public place, those restrictions normally don't apply, because if you have a legal right to be present there, you can photograph something that you would normally observe.
Right.
So it's another situation when you've now got the camera in the air. But our argument is the same, is that if you're complying with all the Part 107 rules and you've got your waivers, you should be entitled to the same protections as you would on the ground.
So really the issue now is if you want to photograph sort of a breaking news or a disaster event like a hurricane, you need to make sure you have a waiver.
Well, it depends. And that's usually the answer in the law. So is there a TFR? Is there a temporary flight restriction over that area? Then you need a waiver from that. So before you fly, as Part 107 compliant, you need to know that you're in airspace that you're allowed to be in, and that you check to see what's going on. They're called NOTAMs, N-O-T-A-M. It's notice to airmen, and they're all available for those areas. So in terms of waivers, the best way to do it is ask for what you want. Too many people are asking, I want to fly, and they pick like 5 miles.
Right.
Because the FAA says, if you can give me a GPS, and let's say you say, I want to fly at 150 feet. They'll say, if you can take 100 at 100 feet maximum, because drones' maximum altitude is 400 above ground level.
Right.
That's as high as a drone can fly, unless you're in 400-foot radius of a building. So there's all these. It's not just easy to say one thing. There are a lot of other rules that you have to be aware of. So that's really an important part of flying.
Is there the possibility for mischief, from the government level with all these rules? So you can restrict drone flying and drone photography in a way that you couldn't necessarily with handheld photography.
Well, I've seen photography. I've been dealing with it on the ground for many years in terms of training police about the fact that they can't necessarily interfere with photographers who are in a public place where they have a legal right to be present. So now it's just now taking it that next step further. But the other part that comes into play, especially with drones, is the privacy issue. Mm-hmm. So there's a safety component, and then there's a privacy component. And back in, I think, 2015, President Obama issued a mandate identifying the National Telecommunications and Information Agency to do best practices on privacy. And again, NPPA was one of the stakeholders. One of the things we made sure to put in place in those best practices was this overarching principle that nothing in these best practices supersedes the rights granted under the First Amendment. So that's why we're always trying to be at the table, and we're hoping to be so when they're working on this next new program.
Right, and you recently had a hand in formulating a series of ethical guidelines for photojournalists and drones.
So now we've been talking about safety, mm-hmm. and we've been talking about the law. And then somewhere in between that is what, the law is what you can and can't do. People rely on the law for certainty. It's like, you want to know if you go through that red light, what the penalty is, and that's fair. And that's why rules are important. But in terms of ethics, now we're talking about, well, you might legally be allowed to do it, but what should you be doing? And so we work with Poynter, Al Tompkins, and a number of other people to develop, ethical guidelines based on some parts of NPPA's Code of Ethics, which is a very strong code of ethics for visual journalists.
So, broadly speaking, can you give us a sense of what those ethics guidelines are, and then also where viewers can find those guidelines?
They're in a number of places, but in terms of ethics, obviously, if you're working in a newsroom, you need to follow newsroom policy and maybe have that policy comport with some of these ethics. But just like anything else, you don't want to necessarily interfere with things. You don't want to get too close, let's say, to wild animals because they don't know what these things are. Mm-hmm. That you don't want to kind of alter things or invade somebody's privacy. And that in itself is trying to figure out what that means. Because at 400 feet with a wide-angle lens, you're not necessarily going to see somebody, but coming down over somebody's yard, to 10 feet while they're in their backyard. It's almost like, a character, I've heard said, is doing the right thing when nobody's looking. So it's a matter of your own ethics, having these guidelines to kind of help you along the way, developing policies in the newsroom. But again, this is all evolving.
Are you optimistic about the trajectory of federal ruling and also just how photojournalists are using drones? I mean, we were talking earlier about how few drone accidents there have been relative to the number of them that have been sold. Are you bullish on the technology and its application?
I think the technology will open up vast opportunities. I mean, we've seen it already in terms of coverage of things that you could not do before, and it makes sense. It makes sense economically. It makes sense from a safety factor. For example, forest fires. So let's say there's one in California. So KNBC takes its Bell Jet Ranger operating at $1,000 an hour with maybe a pilot and a photographer on board, and they fly out 100 miles to shoot and coordinate with the incident commander at the fire. So we're talking about not interfering with firefighting. We're just talking about taking it out there, flying around, getting some high-definition video, and flying back again. Doesn't it make more sense, since you probably have a crew on the ground, to coordinate with the incident commander, not do anything while there's firefighting operations, put up the drone, get the same quality video, save the money, not endanger lives, because we've seen, unfortunately, news choppers go down. And there at the scene, they kind of even know better having been on the ground, where they should operate from. It's just that kind of thing that, and it also levels the playing field. So as an independent journalist, you can get the same shots that a huge news operation with their aircraft can get. So, it definitely has all kinds of opportunities. There are going to be a lot of challenges, but what we're hoping is that everybody acts responsibly and are good stakeholders, because the public really is concerned. I mean, they see drones and they get all bent out of shape. But it's nothing new. When George Eastman invented the Brownie in the 1800s, basically people thought the right to privacy as they knew it was over, because this was the first time somebody could take a camera in their hand, go out in the street and take a picture of anything they want. And it's interesting that Louis Brandeis, who was a Harvard law student, went on to become a well-known Supreme Court justice, along with his partner at Harvard, Samuel Warren, wrote a treatise called The Right to Privacy. And if you read it, you think they were talking about drones today. They were talking about brownies, but they talk about the nosy neighbors and the snooping press.
Right.
And there's nothing different. And there were signs up at the beaches: no cameras, no brownies, banned brownies. And people wore more to the beach back then than they wear to church today. But still, it didn't matter.
Right.
That whole right to privacy thing, and we're just seeing it 140 years later. It's the same thing.
Same debate.
It's just the camera's in the air now.
Great. Well, Mickey, thank you so much for your time and your
Sure.
insights. Appreciate it.
Great.